Going live with Rumaan alum.
I'm Rumaan. I'm a writer and I'm a contributing editor at The New Republic. And tonight's the second installment of our Summer Film Festival. I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Shephard, a staff writer at The New Republic, and our guest this evening is Wendy Keys. Wendy Keys is on the board of film at Lincoln Center, an institution that she's had a many years relationship with as a staff member. Wendy is also on the board of the Sag Harbor Cinema and the High Line and Human Rights Watch. And she's the director of Milton Glazer, To Inform and Delight, a portrait of the artist from 2008. Before we begin our conversation, I just want to talk briefly about who Milton Glazer was, although Wendy's film answers that much more eloquently than I could. Milton Glazer was a graphic designer, but to talk about him as such, I think flattens his contribution to American culture, to visual culture, to magazines. He established a way of thinking about communication that revolutionized the world in which we now live. Milton Glazer was born in 1929 in the Bronx. He died earlier this year at the age of 91. Milton Glazer, To Inform and Delight, is a wonderful portrait of a really fascinating life. And I would love to begin by asking you, Wendy, what your aim was with this movie.
Oh, I had many motivations. When I first heard Milton speak publicly, which was in the International Design Conference in Aspen, where we were both on the board, I was stunned that someone whose work was so visual could be so verbal. He was so articulate, so full of ideas, concepts, and charm that I was really kind of bowled over because, you know, you do hear artists speak about their work. Many are, well, some are good. And, you know, why should they be more articulate and verbal than their own work? Their work is expressing them and their ideas in different mediums. And the same is true of perhaps architects and designers as well. But I just felt when we attended a funeral of a friend of ours, a mutual friend, and I thought, wouldn't it be terrible if something happened to Milton and there was no record of him on film or at all as a man? His work is in books. He's done many books himself. So the work is chronicled, but my key motivation was to show the world what made him a man that had that influence and impact on the world in terms of communication and looking at your work in a different way, not as just one commercial project after another, but thinking constantly about how are you improving the culture by the work that you do.
I have so many more questions, but I forgot to mention that we will take audience questions. So everyone watching, if you look at the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, you can drop your questions for Wendy in there and we'll get to them after Alex and I have given her the third degree of our own.
Ouch.
I want to talk to you, Wendy, or I want to ask you whether you as a person, so you met Milton in a sort of personal capacity, but I wondered whether you had a sense of an aspect of the culture that he had defined for you without you, whether or not you realized that it was his work, whether there was something that was Milton Glazer that was in your consciousness by the time that you met him.
Well, that's a great question because I think a lot of his influence, people don't know. They absorb what his work has done for the community, but they don't know really who it is. I guess personally, I would say New York Magazine and what he contributed to not only to the city, but to the world of magazines with his contribution there was, you know, he co-founded it with Clay Felker. Clay provided a lot of the content, but Milton provided that sort of outreach where he was using the magazine as a vehicle and as a guide for people to survive New York in the 70s and to really help them navigate a difficult time in a wonderful, thriving city. But it was, you know, there were challenges. And by really thinking of the customer as a participant in his work, he he shifted, of course, magazine publications incredibly, because before that it had been wonderful magazines like your own that had smart articles by smart people, and they were telling us things. But with New York Magazine, it was a much more participatory, really a guide to living in a difficult city. But for instance, sort of how to deal with your landlord, where to find the best pastrami sandwich,
Yeah.
how to just navigate everything in the city. And of course, then other cities picked up the format and the template, and it spread all over the world, as it should have. So
I mean, Alex, you're really our media guy. Like,
Well,
have you ever heard of Milton Glaser and Clay Felker spoken about as sort of like the keys to that kind of service journalism?
well, so I mean, Clay Felker, and I think New York Magazine invented service journalism, but I mean, it's funny I think it's Milton Glaser's influences in so many different things. Yeah. It's almost like he escapes notice by being so omnipresent. I mean, I have a few questions about this, but one of the things that struck me as I was watching this film is the extent to which that era of New York Magazine invented a whole idea of the city. I think on the one hand, you certainly had all these films that were coming out in the 70s that were using this background of New York, but I think the vision that Clay and Milton had was one that really surpassed that. It continues to live with us in that there's a wonderful scene in the movie where he's eating dim sum, and I was thinking that, oh my God, for the first time ever, I realized that this is how, this idea of seeing a city through a magazine didn't exist like this before that. And just what it was like to sort of see New York through Milton's eyes as the magazine, particularly in that early era, did so well.
Well, I think that was, all those features were defined by Milton's participation in the warmth and generosity of his speech, of his persona, of his spirit, and also fueled by his deep love of the city. He talks about at the end of the film, he makes a little tribute to the city, talking about the fact that New York, unlike any other city in the world, welcomes the newcomers, absorbs what they bring, the food, the culture, the language, the look, everything. Whereas if you go to Paris, you kind of have to become a Parisian. Whereas New York is really absorbs and is made better by the visitors and the immigrants. And he gets very excited about this concept, and that passion for the city and all that it offers in terms of education, cultural opportunities, reaches sort of a crescendo at the end of the film, and then he has this giant smile at the end of it. So I was pleased that was the emphasis. But the magazine had so many different ramifications, one of them being the Underground Gourmet that he did with Jerome Snyder. What he did by reviewing little ethnic, inexpensive restaurants around the city was to give permission to the middle-class New Yorkers. You can go there, you can eat Cuban Chinese food. It sounds strange, but it's really good. And so he enlarged the experience of being a New Yorker. It was just part of the mosaic of experiences that he created for the city that he loves so much.
He tosses off during one of those sections. I think it's quietly revolutionary in the way that a lot of his stuff is, where he says, "Oh, nobody used to cover these places because they didn't have any money to advertise."
That's exactly it.
But you're like, that changed service journalism forever.
Yeah.
And it was just this idea that you could go anywhere in the city. And he has a great line where he says, "Why, if I want Hungarian food, why would I not go to Hungarian neighborhood to get it?"
Yeah.
But I thought that was really striking because it suggested this casual vision he had as a journalist, really, despite having, obviously a great deal of experience, but not a proper journalistic background. Did you get the sense that he clearly has a great admiration for journalism, but he seems to have a journalistic vision, or seems to have had a journalistic vision as well?
Yes, he wanted to share the information that he gathered, and he was very generous about that. In fact, as he got older, I think his urgency was amplified by I have to be louder. I have to speak more about my feelings about the way people should go through their own lives and handle their own work. But well, to be honest too, as a journalist, he was also a great foodie. And he loved food. He loved restaurants. He designed many restaurants. He cooked. He was a very good cook. I was a sous chef in the Aspen Design Conference for 30 years. And luckily I was invited to sit at the table as well. So it was, he really enjoyed it with a gusto, to say the least. So that was also a big part of his work and his interest in sharing what he learns. And the sharing is what is really why he feels so strongly about being a teacher, and why he feels so strongly about being a mentor to so many people, really thousands of people. Yeah. And he just feels, I've lived a life, I've had experiences, I want to share them. And that's a journalistic impulse, certainly.
He seems uninterested in categorizing what his own practice was when you speak to him. He says at one point in the film this thing, first of all, I should say that this is much like what you said at the top in your early remarks, and Katrina Vanden Heuvel says this about Milton Glaser on camera, that to hear him speak is remarkable. And it is true that he speaks like somebody who has spent a lifetime lecturing or something. Like, he's just very able to say what he means and to take a complex thought and sort of say it. But what he says at the beginning of your film is the core value is the act of making things. It's not the distinction between I'm a fine artist, I'm a commercial artist, I'm designing the packaging on a bag of birdseed for a local grocery chain. It's like, it's all one project. Is there a project in that sort of broad portfolio that to you feels like it really represents who Milton Glaser was as an artist?
Well, as you pointed out, he's so eclectic that there's really no one thing. He talks about enjoying working with the high and the low. And he says, you know, a good ham and Swiss cheese sandwich is just as good as a creme brulee. In fact, maybe it's even better.
Yeah.
But you know, he would do the Rainbow Room in the top of Rockefeller Center. He would redesign that. And then he would do a ball of yarn, you know, the design for, I can't remember the name of the yarn company, but he would take on each project with the same amount of integrity and concentration and humanity. And that's what made his work so special, because he combined that with his own genius. But that instinct of commitment and integrity was really what separates him from the rest of the pack, I think.
Yeah.
There seems to be a deeply egalitarian ethos as well. I think, you know, not to turn this into a referendum on my opinions about a lot of public art, but I think that there's a passivity to a lot of that where, you know, you go and you take your picture in front of it or whatever. But the approach that he takes is one in which the viewer is always a participant. I thought that there was something, he keeps coming back to this idea in the film of making things just complicated enough. And it's not like a trick the way you would hear somebody in advertising talk about it, but it's a way of getting them to actually participate in graphic design. And, you know, I mean, I'm a journalist and don't think about these things, but it sort of, I never considered that for a moment. And yet there's something that seems deeply political in that as well. I was wondering if you could talk about his politics as part of his design.
Well, they are illustrated beautifully in a book called Design of Dissent. And when he grew up, he grew up in the projects in the Bronx. I'm sure they have a name, but I don't remember them. And it was called Little Moscow. So an egalitarian nature came to him very early, and I think he was nurtured by his family. It was a warm, loving family, and these feelings I really remained throughout. I mean, when you talk about his point of view, the way he approaches his work from the consumer point of view, the customer's point of view. I think it's very well illustrated in his work that he did for Jimmy Goldsmith for the supermarkets, the Grand Union supermarkets. He was not thinking of how to please Jimmy Goldsmith, the client. He was thinking of how to make the experience of shopping in a supermarket more congenial, less tiring, less confusing. And he did that in terms of the layout, creating little markets over here, wider aisles, brighter colored, soup cans. So this was always the way he attacked every problem or every task. And actually, he said he learned a lot from that exercise working for Grand Union, because he had to put his head into the mind of the general populace, not to make design for the little smarty pants, the little design elite that that sometimes he was catering to, but to really the people who go shopping in supermarkets, which is everybody. And so he said he learned a lot from that. He was constantly teaching and learning, which is what is so wonderful. When I asked him actually if I could make a film about him, he said, well, sure, I guess. And I said, well, I'm a first-time filmmaker, and I don't know if you want to trust this important task to me. But he said, why don't we make it a learning experience for both of us? So as I was shooting, maybe 2 days later, he would sit me down and say, well, what have you learned? Where are your surprises? Because I spent my whole life watching films, but never really made a proper film per se. And he would do this all through the process of shooting, editing, post-production, and there were surprises, and he was interested in them. He was interested in the process. I didn't get him too involved in the process because it really, I had to keep some distance between what he wanted and my own idea of what I wanted to say about it. But the fact that he approached the whole thing as a learning experience just, is typical of the way he looked at everything.
You spoke about, the desire to make this film sort of because of your own affection for him and your own interest in him. But I wonder if you could talk about the logistics of making your first film and what that was like. You were somebody with a lot of experience in the universe of film, but you weren't like fresh out of film school. So what did that look like for you?
Well, I really felt that because my work prior was making selections for the New York Film Festival, curating different shows at the Walter Reed Theater, curating programs at Museum of Modern Art. And you'd say, I like your film, you. It was kind of obnoxious, really. And so I thought I should put myself in the shoes, these shoes of these filmmakers, and really see what the experience is myself. And when I started, also I was just about to retire from Lincoln Center, so I wanted something to do as I was making that transition from that job into the void, basically. So I decided to make this film. And at first I thought, maybe I'll make it a shiny little bauble using animations, skimming along the surface. And I thought, no, Milton is too substantial for that. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll just do a day in the life. But that was too limiting. That wouldn't allow me biographical details that are important, I think. And it just was too limiting. Then I thought, okay, I'll shoot the interviews because we were comfortable together, and then I'd give the footage to somebody, a real filmmaker. And then once I had shot it, I said, no, I'm keeping this. This is mine, and I'm going to work hard on this. And what it did when I made the decision was it certainly sharpened my focus and heightened my nerves. But obviously I'm glad I did it. He was glad I did it. And there were other things that came out of my history of watching thousands of other people's documentaries. And I thought, no talking heads, no baby pictures. Then of course, as I'm starting to work on it, I need the talking heads. They need
Yeah.
to be saying the things about Milton that he would never say about himself.
Yeah.
And I need those baby pictures because Milton as a baby was a hoot. So, I mean, so all my little, things that I was determined I wasn't going to do in the beginning, went into the dust as I realized that there was a reason documentaries have talking heads.
Yeah. Yeah.
There
And sort
is
of like how he would talk about design, right? It's like you have to sort of fulfill the user expectation. Like the documentary has to fulfill the audience expectation of like, here's the story of the man's life. Like, here's what you know of his work. Like, here's, if you think you don't know his name, here's all this proof that you actually do know his work,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Alex. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say something similar, but that the film also does provide a kind of slice of life. I was thinking it's such a sort of casual portrait of a generation of people in media. I mean, it moved me to see Peter Mayer's face.
Yes,
Someone
yes.
who's angry emails I dearly miss. And I was wondering what it was like to be a fly on the wall for these people who, really defined magazine and literary publishing in a lot of ways in the city.
Well, Peter was a very close friend of Milton's. And so it was very comfortable. That scene was actually shot at 8:00 in the morning before it doesn't look it, because Peter's smoking up a storm and there's wine glasses all over the place. It was wonderful to hear Milton relax. Well, Milton was always relaxed, but sharing stories with a friend. And also when he was with Walter Bernard, who is also a dear, dear friend of his, as well as collaborator for many years. They worked together on New York Magazine, and then they established this company, WBMG, where they did, I'm sure you know, the revamping of magazines and newspapers all over the world. And they've actually just come out with a book that I'd like to plug as hard as I can, called Mag Men.
Have it right behind me. Yeah.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
It's fun. Well, yes, you would. So it was nice for me to be in the company of people who adored him. Also, to see him interact with his wife, Shirley, the warmth that they shared, and the work that they did together, doing children's books. So that was very nice.
Yeah, I mean, there was interest. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that along those lines, it's such a cynical industry in so many ways, but there is something about his personality, but also that really shines through in the design itself, that one is just, I mean, this is true of the service journalism as well, that it took this thing that was deeply cynical and brought something genuine to it. But also with Milton's design, I was thinking he talks about drawing in the movie, like drawing is thinking for him. And I was thinking about how, even though his designs are so sleek in many ways, there's always this handcrafted quality to them. And what was it like was he fiddling and drawing things while you were working the film?
Actually, I just found this little stack of drawings that he would do for me because we would sit beside each other in the board meetings in Aspen, and he would do this one particular dog for me. I'm getting off track a little bit here, but I can't help but show it to you. He's sort of like an imaginary dog with his little tiny ears and polka dots and everything. And he did many, many of these. And once we were in Jerusalem with the board, having a board meeting there, we spoiled ourselves incredibly. And my father had just died, and I was looking for a cross for his grave. And so Milton accompanied me to sort of these handicraft shops and everything. And I found sort of the perfect one, not too simple, not too fancy. And Milton was yelling at me in the courtyard outside of the store saying, come, you have to come immediately. And in a fountain in the courtyard were carved these heads of dogs that were perfect replicas of this imaginary dog that he'd been drawing for me all these years. And those kinds of magical things would always happen with him. And it's just, there was the other, I mean, this is personal and I don't know, but the day I saw his obituary in the New York Times, they had some examples of his poster work. And I was very moved because he had done, and I haven't spoken to you about this, but before I met my husband, my first late husband, whatever, ex-husband, he did posters for him. He was a concert producer and did music tours around the world. And many of them were terrific. The Mahalia Jackson poster, which is kind of iconic, he did for my husband, Gary. But there on the page of his obituary was a poster he did for me beside a poster that he did for Gary. He did a New York Film Festival poster and the Mahalia Jackson poster. And I was very moved by it. It felt like one of those magical Milton moments. Yeah. And then I was sort of wondering, do you think he did the layout for his own obituary? I wouldn't put it past him. But that's you know,
remarkable.
The relationship, the association with him was always sprinkled with some magical dust all the time. Makes me sad.
I want to talk a little bit about like what he actually designed that everybody knows. And there's a moment in the film where one of the talking heads, who you did not want to include because you wanted to reinvent the documentary, he talks about Milton establishing a visual language for psychedelia, like, and it's such a remarkable statement because it's so true that when I think of that moment in American culture, or when I think of what represents that moment in American culture, I think of the illustration of Bob Dylan in profile with the, you know, sort of halo of color around him. And it's just so strange to think that that is just one man's imagining and distilling a cultural moment. And then I think it's a second person in your film points out that that was not, Milton himself was born in 1929. So he was already like a grown man in that moment, like, but he understood something about the culture of the generation that was succeeding him. Mm-hmm. And I find that so remarkable. Like, I'm hard pressed to even think of like anything analogous in the culture right now where somebody who was in their 40s or 50s could understand something about like the movement or thinking about people who were teenagers, you know, and that give and affix a visual language to it. It's so striking to me because we're talking about like, you know, a child of immigrants born in 1929 in the Bronx. That is not like a flower child, right? Like that's not the perspective, but somehow he defined that perspective.
Well, that look, that hallucinogenic look, which we then later, I mean, it was really kind of Art Nouveau in a way, yeah. All the curls and the curves.
Yeah.
And that sensuality was then deepened with the Haight-Ashbury concert posters, you know. But what he and his colleagues at Pushpin, and mostly him, did was they exploded the precedent before this came along of the modernist strictures of design, the Bauhaus look, where everything was very, you know, angled and chic and constructivist. And he said, let's use everything that's out there. So to look at the Dylan poster that you mentioned, the profile is a tribute to Duchamp, who made a self-portrait of himself in silhouette. And then the hair is really a reference to Islamic design. So he was a scholar of visual, he took the influences, but of visual work and art around the world through the ages. And he said, it's okay, we can do this, we can have curves, we don't have to be restricted to this Germanic Swiss principle that had been really defining what design was for quite a long time before he and his Pushpin colleagues came along and blew it to pieces. But that is a huge contribution to the history of design.
Yeah.
Just that in itself.
Yeah.
And he, to be honest, he he never took drugs. He was a man of his own generation, but he had antennas out to pick up what was in the air. So that's not too surprising, really, that he got that before it happened.
And he seemed to be particularly invested in other mediums, though, as well. I mean, I think that's true of some graphic designers, but I can't, he certainly seemed to be very invested in music. And then, again, his work in journalism, seemed to show this eclecticism, not just in his design, but also as a kind of operating principle. I was just impressed by there were things that would flash by, like John Lee Hooker album cover. Like, I had no idea he designed the electric Kool-Aid acid test. I could look around my house and pull things out that I've looked at 100 times and I had no idea. And I think, did you get the sense, particularly with music, that he was also sort of invested in this? I mean, he seems to be a true polymath. He
was a true polymath. And while he may not have attended all the concerts that my late husband produced, and he may not have really enjoyed all the music, I mean, he wouldn't have followed it, but he would try, in trying to create a visual manifestation, he would try to understand it. He wouldn't play it then on the weekend after having worked on what it probably represented, but he didn't do it casually. He would certainly try to get to the bottom of what the appeal was and what that work was. Actually, one of his last clients, I guess, was this classical musician from Brazil, and he was designing DVD covers for him. And you can see it in the film where he was working with one of his colleagues, and he really enjoyed. That was music that he really enjoyed. It was classical music, and he would come to New York every so often, and we would go to the concert and stuff. So
there's also there's a funny thing that happens with some of this work. Like Alex said, when you're seeing, when you're seeing the examples kind of fly by in the film, there's so much that you recognize. And then there are certain things that become so closely identified with the subject at hand that you kind of can't believe they're all the work of the same visual sensibility. And the other example that I have is the cover. Well, I know it as the cover for the published text of Angels in America, but I think it was probably also used just for the visual identity of that play when it first existed. And it would not have occurred to me ever to think that it's the same hand that designed I Love New York or the Dylan and Profile, because I associate that image so much with Tony Kushner's work. Like there's just something that happened where he seems to comprehend something about the material at hand and deliver both his own visual sensibility, but sort of distill something about the work that he's doing for a client.
Yeah, no, it's him really getting to the essence of whatever the challenge is. And certainly projects like that were what really animated him more and more towards the end. He did an enormous amount of pro bono work, for not only for cultural organizations, but for educational organizations, human rights, or he did something with me with Human Rights Watch. And he was, this is what gave him pleasure, because he felt that he was adding something to the culture. And whereas in the beginning of his career, he would say that he would do anything for anybody. But as he got older, he was only working with people that he liked on projects that really made sense for him. So you can see it more and more. But the amount of pro bono work is just extraordinary. Nobody does that. I mean, he had a studio with people that he had to really keep engaged with paying customers, and he and they would work very, very hard on I mean, anything that I brought to him with, could you please help me with this, he would do. And then I would bring in my friends, could you help my friend? think I took a little advantage of his good nature, but I mean, nobody else does so much pro bono work. It's just mind-boggling.
Something too about the other sort of omnipresent thing is the I Love New York logo. One of those things that feels like it wasn't created by anybody, that it just appeared on a keychain or something.
That's right.
But I was thinking that it's also strange in that is almost like the only thing that he created that turned into kitsch almost, but even then that as with New York, it also played such an important role in this transitional moment in the city twice, right? First in the 1970s and then again after September 11th, as being, this sort of strange kind of icon of people's, often baffling love of this city. But did he ever feel, I was looking through obituaries and, many of them do say I Love New York creator, but it's sort of shocking how much other stuff there is there, but yeah.
Right. Well, that was another part of the motivation of making the film, is to show the enormous range and scope of his work. And, the film went to some film festivals and it had a nice theatrical life, and people would come away saying, I learned so much because I don't really think of design, even though it's so ubiquitous around us, as you say. It was on a keychain before anybody thought of it, but no, somebody actually thought of it. And I was always surprised that at festivals it would win the best educational film. And I'd say, really? And people would say, I learned so much, because nobody, people outside of our little world don't really think about how and why this is created, what the process is, who the people are. That was another motivation, was because, while design is so ubiquitous, the practitioners are not well known. Whereas certainly artists are, people can drop all kinds of names at a dinner party of artists and architects and blah, blah, blah. But the world of designers really needs a little more light shone on them, I think. Yeah. So that was part of my motivation too, is to say, hey, these guys work all around you. They're creating your environment, and show them what the process is and what the thinking behind it was. I had one sort of struck me before I decided to make the film. At Lincoln Center, I was curating films for the Walter Reed Theater. I was doing thematic film programs and retrospectives. And two of them were design related. One was called Designing Dreams, and it was about production design and costume design in film. And I was stunned at how grateful these people were. I mean, usually I have to beg and claw to get people on a panel. Well, not really, but these people would fly in from London and Los Angeles on their own dime. And they said, nobody ever salutes us. Nobody recognizes us. And that's within the film world. Yeah. And the other one I did was on movie title design. And Saul Bass, of course, did achieve a certain notoriety for his titles because they were so spectacular and they were in front of wonderful films by Hitchcock and Preminger. But, otherwise, these are people that are not really acknowledged by the mainstream or even within in this case, the film community. And I thought that was awful. I really wanted to correct that somehow.
Can you talk briefly about the title of the film and how you came to the title of this particular film?
Well, actually, I have to give Milton credit for that. As you may have noticed, he did.
Yes.
One of his favorite expressions, that art is to inform and delight. And I think it was Socrates or somebody who said it. Maybe not Socrates.
Horace.
Okay.
Somebody said? I can't remember now.
Anyway, but the fun part of it, because at first I thought it was pretentious and silly, but because in inform there's form, and in delight there's light. So and he played with that. He did the opening titles, And so he played with that in such a charming way, I couldn't resist. And we really didn't have many disputes, but there was one argument that we really went to, he really, when I did the fast collage of the posters and his images, I had different colored backdrops for each of the images, and he wanted a white backdrop so that the images were all you saw. And I said, no, I want the colored. And for a designer, this is big stuff.
Yeah.
And I actually won it. But he talked about it for years afterwards. You know, she really wanted it. That wasn't my idea. And so he's not used to having people sort of go up against him. Actually, I'm sort of going off track, I think, a bit. But one of the reasons I wanted Katrina vanden Heuvel in the film, and I didn't prod her or coach her, but I was delighted when she said that he's an intimidating man. When he was in full flower, he was big. He had big face, big hands, and fully confident of his own experience and his reputation and his genius. And so I loved it when she, with all the gravitas that she could bring to an interview like that, she said she was kind of nervous about him because he was so awesome in a way. And then, of course, they melted and merged and loved each other. And it was a very happy and congenial collaboration that they had together.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I thought that was a really important point, because so much of the film is occupied by Milton Glaser himself, and he's utterly charming and just like someone who, he knows who he was, but he's got a very down to earth way of speaking about what his life has been. And so it was striking to hear somebody, an extremely accomplished peer of his, saying that he was in fact intimidating, that there was this sort of, to be in the presence of somebody who you know to be a genius can be very stressful and intimidating. And it was nice to hear that, because he's such a charmer, and like so much of the movie is just of him charming the camera,
Yeah. Well, actually, when I would have private conversations with some of his staff, they said initially that they were nervous because he's a man with strong ideas, and but then once he learns to respect and admire your work, then he will, fold into a very healthy and congenial kind of collaboration. You could see, and it wasn't staged, but you could see the interaction that he had with the people in his office. They worked very well together.
Yeah.
One of the things with the Katrina section as well that I thought was very striking, I will preface this by saying, before we did the last one of these, I did make an informal agreement not to mention the president in this, but I did not make that agreement in this, but that this was a film made at the end of the Bush era, and that the way that Milton talks about George W. Bush is in some ways very reminiscent of the way that I talk about the current president, but also, well, one, it was just interesting to be transported back to those moments, which I've largely tried to push into the recesses of my brain. But I think also it showed, I think, a somewhat more strident political Milton Glaser coming out, particularly with the kinds of buttons that he's making. And it's largely subtextual in the movie, but he does seem to be deeply distressed by the state of the country in 2007. I was wondering what it was like to be making a film like this in that moment.
Well, he was very overt about his distress, and that was fine with me, certainly. But what concerned me is that when it was being shown later in the Obama years, and he's saying, these are dark and terrible times, and I thought I should have an addendum. This was shot, these particular interviews were shot during the heyday of George W. Bush. But I can tell you that the social interactions, the lunches and dinners that I've had with him in the last 4 years, he was deeply despairing of the present situation. And I didn't really have, our last conversation was about 10 days before he died. We didn't have a chance really to talk about COVID and how that affects the city, which is of great concern to him, and of course the looming presence of Donald Trump. But I know that, and the terrible repercussions of his negligence of, anyway, I don't want to get onto that too much, but anyway, so he was very engaged in this, and it was something that concerned him enormously.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the reasons when we were just sort of designing this program that I wanted to speak about Milton Glazer was, of course, the fact that we just lost him earlier this year. And so it felt like a perfect moment to talk about, you know, his life and his legacy. I think it is a perfect moment. And I mentioned to you, Wendy, earlier that watching this film made me so profoundly nostalgic for a New York that has maybe just slipped past us. Milton Glazer, an immigrant's kid living in the Bronx, had the benefit of, and he speaks very clearly and forcefully about this in the film, had the benefit of sterling public education, and went off to the Cooper Union, which at the time that he was there wouldn't have charged students. I understand that it does now charge tuition. He's a product of like the best kinds of things our society sort of imagined for itself, and then went on to do such great things himself. And in this, watching this film, I felt such a yearning for an ideal of public education that cared so deeply about educating immigrant kids in the city's outer boroughs. And I felt so moved by the notion of this. He speaks in the film about how his office is located near a playground and how he derives some great pleasure from that. And in fact, in your on-camera interviews, you can hear all the children playing in the distance. And I just derived so much joy from thinking about this man who was a product of a city that was really just a polyglot place that like cared about its citizens. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's happened to that New York, or what your sense of where that New York is now, Wendy.
Oh, my own sense. I'm deeply afraid, and certainly thinking of what he added to the city and what he admired and loved about the city. What of that is going to be left? I'm concerned for some friends. I'm concerned for those few people that I know that has suffered from the virus and are still trying to get better. But I feel a very strong, I'm an immigrant too, you know, I came in on a green card and took out my citizenship. I was pointed towards New York all my life. And I feel very strongly about New York City as an entity that I pray will prevail and recover and maybe even be improved in some level. But there's so much work to do. That one just prays that we're able to get a grip on things, to correct some of the wrongs, and then to take advantage of some of the new things that have presented themselves to us, like hopefully a broader understanding of the racist tendencies of not only the police, but people in their daily lives. And hopefully these lessons can be applied to a better city and a better country. But I despair right now. I'm despairing. I hope I'm going to feel a little better in November, but at this moment, when I go back to the city, I worry deeply.
There is a hope in this film. We're sort of hearing this gentleman speak. I found it kind of cheering. Like, I found it sort of reassuring. And so I will say the film is an exercise in revisiting a New York that like we haven't been able to see for the past few months. And I found that reassuring. I do want to pose some of the questions we have from our audience for you. So we have a question. It seems that Milton Glazer would have been successful at anything he did. Did he ever talk about the road not followed? He made a choice to go to LaGuardia instead of Bronx Science. I wonder if he ever mused about choosing art over science.
No, apparently he had a talent for science too. And yet he knew once somebody drew a bird on a paper bag, and he was so taken by the fact that a pencil could do that on paper that it was irresistible. He could only follow this path. He never looked back. And he felt grateful that his teachers encouraged him and that his parents encouraged him. And so I don't think there was a road not taken. What he probably would have liked is if he had carved out a little more time throughout his life to do the non-commissioned work, you know, the fine art that he did. You know, he did books, he did one on Matisse, he did all kinds he did a Piero della Francesca homage, and he would have enjoyed, I think, doing a little more of that. But he, you know, he did a collaboration with, oh my God, the Frenchman who, oh well, anyway, I haven't seen the film in a little while, and I haven't watched the Frenchman for a while. But he did have some very fun projects in which he could not have a problem to solve that a client had presented him. So I think if he ever had a regret, it might be that he would have wanted a little more time to do that. But he liked solving the puzzles. I mean, when he talks about I Heart New York, he likes to present a puzzle to the consumers, like a tiny little puzzle of a you know, a noun and a symbol and a abbreviation, and it all works so beautifully. But he and I'm glad that we haven't spent the whole time talking about I Heart New York, because he was afraid that that was his entire legacy.
I mean, imagine having the kind of career where that's only one highlight to be discussed. Like, it's a pretty remarkable thing that, like, you could do something so significant and it's still not even, like, it's just in the top 10 of the things that we could talk about, you know?
Yeah.
Wendy, what happened to his studio and his archive? Do you know what the fate of that will be?
Actually, I tried to find something. He has archives all over the place. He did at Stony Brook, because he was doing a big project out there with Shirley Kenny, who was then the president, and then Stony Brook College just kind of turned into something else. I don't, you know, want to go into that. But so School of Visual Arts has a great deal of his material. I think Cooper Union might as well, but there's vast amounts of paper, you know, because he was so busy. And my late husband had a collection of the posters they did together. They actually formed a company called Glass Key. And so that he had a collection of all his material that they did together. But I would, it would take a little research and digging to find out, but, and I don't know who his last studio manager was, because he left that wonderful building on 32nd Street, where New York Magazine magically was produced on, you know, it's just insane, 40 people in this really rather small brownstone with one bathroom on one floor and all these people all over each other doing it. But he loved that. So his material is around and can be probably.
And had he left his studio, like had he concluded his working life in the last decade?
Just in the last months.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, he always said that he would like to die at his desk, but he, you know, he loved the work. He just loved it. And he had a very, very quiet domestic life. You didn't see Milton around town at book parties or openings or things. You know, he was not, he and Shirley led a quiet life and would see friends quietly. So, and they lived in a beautiful apartment, first on the block where Hotel des Artistes is, with all those wonderful features. And then they moved downtown to be, because they couldn't climb the stairs basically to get up to the sleeping loft. So, And then I think that he bought a 2-bedroom apartment for an aide, which of course he didn't need at the end. So, but
it's such a remarkable American story and such a remarkable New York story, and it's just impossible to kind of sum up what the accomplishment is. Like, it's not I Love New York as a sort of visual icon. It's not New York Magazine as a journalistic endeavor. It's not like conceiving of the look of the psychedelic era in this country. You know, it's about so much more, and it's just sort of impossible to sort of summarize. But I thought your film was such a lovely way of meeting this person who affected the culture that we all live in such a profound way. And it's not a, you know, the film it's very educational, as you said. It's in the educational category at certain film festivals, but it never felt like I was doing my homework. I felt like I was just sitting with somebody's really captivating uncle at like a dinner party and just learning like everything that I could know about this person. It's really an interesting movie.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And actually, you know, he's well known around the world for entirely different reasons. In Rio, they know him because he redesigned their newspaper, El Globo. And in France, he's known because of his work with Paris Match and with this unnamed French designer whose name I forgot. And Italy, his work with Piero della Francesca and his homages to Giorgio Morandi, under whom he studied in Bologna as a Fulbright scholar, which shaped him enormously in terms of devoting the pure integrity to the work. And I think that his biographical story, you know, not only growing up lower middle class or, you know, working class family in the Bronx and the projects, but and the fact that he came from a warm and loving family, which always, as we know, makes all the difference. But the fact that he had wonderful education here, but his association with Morandi had a profound effect on him, because Morandi just had made work that he felt that he had to make. It was pure. It wasn't commercial. He didn't know. He never met with dealers or gallery people. He just made the art, and it was a great lesson for him. He also enjoyed the food of Bologna too.
There's such an engagement and curiosity with the world that rings through his work, but also, you know, I was thinking about it in the context of not getting, you know, being trapped in my Brooklyn apartment for 5 months, and that one of the things that he seemed to embody was the thing that makes this city so wonderful, is the sense that you can go out your door and have a different experience with something, you know, that you could never have encountered before. But his ability, which you capture so well in this film, to turn that into design, to share it with other people, you know, it's really remarkable. And I'm trying to now turn this into a question, but for me, it was just so striking to see somebody who I think it's just so embodied the best and most hopeful qualities about this city, in a similar political moment in many ways, but also, you know, to then see it through 12 years is really striking.
Well, when I talk about him and I think about him, you know, sometimes it sounds so Pollyannish that he was motivated by the feeling to do good deeds, you know, but he was, and it was such an instinctive element in his spirit and his personality that he had no choice but to think that way. And it's almost too good to be true, actually. Somebody said, well, where's the dark side of Milton Glaser? And I said, I'm sorry, I know you would love a little something, but there really is no dark side. He represents the light. And for that, you know, we're all grateful. We're reaping the benefits and will for a long time.
That's a great place to end. Wendy Keys is the director of Milton Glazer, To Inform and Delight. It's a wonderful movie. I'm so glad that you could be our guest tonight. Really, really appreciated hearing you talk about it, and congratulations on the film. Although it is a decade old now, you don't need to be congratulated anymore, but it's really beautiful, and it's still doing its job of informing and delighting new audiences about this person who you cared about so deeply.
Well, thank you for your attention and your kind words, Rumaan and Alex. It was fun. It feels good for me to ruminate about him because I miss him, but somehow putting it in words makes it feel a little better.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. I will be here next week for a conversation with the New Republic's Joe Livingston about the film Camille Claudel 1915.
Ooh.
That's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.